Hello, I'm Erica Christensen. I'm a postdoc with the Jornada, and today I'm going to talk about the Permanent Quadrat project. So when you say the word long-term, it can mean a lot of things, but in this case, we're working with permanent quadrats that were set up in 1915 and are still sampled to this day. When the Quadrat project was started in 1915, one of the original objectives was to monitor the effect of grazing management on perennial grass cover. To this end, permanent 1 meter by 1 meter quadrats were established across the Jornada. This is a picture of one of our quadrats. There were 122 of these deployed between 1915 and about 1928. And originally this was an experimental framework. So the quadrats were placed in different pastures with different stocking rates and different distances from watering points. The quadrats are currently remeasured every 5 years. The most recent sampling was in 2016. So we have 101 years of vegetation change. And so this is the spatial distribution of where our quadrats are located. This map was made by Darren James, and it shows the location of our 122 quadrats. And notice they aren't evenly distributed across the Jornada. There are quite a few clustered around headquarters, so that area will be characterized pretty well with this data set. But there are very few located up in the mountains in the eastern region of the Jornada. So this is what data collection looks like. This picture is from 1935, but the same methods are still used today. These are chart quadrats, meaning every individual plant within the quadrat is charted onto paper using this device, which is a pantograph. So the person in the center is using the stylus to trace around every little plant. And this causes a pencil at the other end of the arm to trace that shape onto the data sheet. So you can imagine how long it takes to do even one quadrat this way, much less 122. So we have 122 quadrats that were charted in roughly 71 years of that 100-year period. So taking into account that not every quadrat was charted in every year, there are still about 5,125 charts that make up the data set. And of these 5,000 or so charts that exist, around 1,500 have never been digitized. And so they haven't been used in analyses yet. So they only exist as paper data sheets. And now we're in the middle of an effort to digitize these historical data and add them to the digitized data set. So our new efforts, we now have processed around 800 of these. And I really need to acknowledge all the people doing this work. Connie Maxwell, Amy Slaughter, Laura Burkett have been doing a lot of this digitizing work. And in this figure, also made by Darren, you can see this just shows the progress of that project. So on the x-axis, these are all the years of the different samples we have. The y-axis are all the names of the 122 quadrats. And the green square represents a chart that has already been digitized and added to the data set. The blue are the ones that we've just recently done, and the gold squares are the charts that we still have yet to do. So all in all, we have added a historical time series of about 15 more quadrats. And now I just want to say something about how special it is to work with old data. So we have the data sheets, but we can't actually talk to the data collectors. And we probably don't have a lot of context on how the data was collected. Sometimes even the methods have been lost when you're working with 100-year-old data. So to give you an idea of what we're working with, this is a species key from one of our actual data sheets from 1915. So if you can read that handwriting, it says at the top, that's a grama, red 3-on, not sure what the third one is. And sometimes they would just describe it like twin leaves or curbed tube flower. So we're in good shape at the Jornada actually, because a lot of this information has been written down. And there are a lot of supplemental data sheets that we can use to track down this information and help translate what these species are in modern taxonomy. So that translation is one of the things that Connie Maxwell has been doing a lot of work on. So translating these old notes into Bouteloua areopoda, or Aristida species. But we need to go even farther than that, so to ensure the highest possible quality for this data. Figuring out what the data collectors thought a species was isn't the entire battle. So because these are time series data, we can use the fact that there are subsequent time steps to ensure that there is species continuity through time. And that's one of the things I've been working on using automated R scripts. So basically looking at each quadrat as a time series and looking for anomalies in the data. So when you look at, here we're looking at Prosopis glandulosa, mesquite over time, and these sharp dips and peaks are very suspicious. When you have a long-lived shrub like mesquite, you would expect to see sort of a smooth increase or decrease. So these are data points that we'd have to go back and double check and make sure that those are good quality data points. So now that I've given you an idea of what it's taken to get this data set together, I want to talk about how this is such a powerful data set for investigating change on the Jornada. So in particular, I'm going to talk about the story of perennial grasses. And you can clearly see in these two pictures in 1935, this quadrat had some pretty patchy perennial grasses, but in 2016, it's entirely bare ground in the middle of some mesquite dunes. So grass loss and shrub encroachment is a familiar story in the Southwest. And you can see this story again in the shrub data. So this first graph is showing the average cover per quadrat of grasses in orange over time, and cover of shrubs in blue. So clearly grass has declined. It experienced a recovery period in the 1960s and 70s. And in the modern era, it's continuing to decrease, whereas shrub is showing the opposite pattern. There's a continuous monotonic increase of average shrub cover on the quadrats. And when you categorize each quadrat as a shrub quadrat, grass-covered quadrat, or bare, again, we see a steady progression from almost entirely grass-covered quadrats in the early days to mostly shrub-covered quadrats or even bare quadrats in the most recent years. But keep in mind that these quadrats are only 1 square meter, so the increase in bare quadrats doesn't necessarily mean the Jornada is turning into a flat wasteland. In reality, these bare quadrats are probably like the picture from the previous slide, just bare ground embedded within shrublands. But either way, it's clear that we are in the midst of a trend away from grass cover and towards increased shrub cover in the Jornada. So one of the reasons that this data set is so valuable is that we have frequent samples going back through time. So we have a detailed record of the dynamics of how this transition occurred. So we can ask questions like, which came first, grass loss or shrub encroachment? And did one appear to cause the other? So when we look at the timing at the Jornada, the answer seems to be both. So this is a plot of the timing of shrub appearance. So the year of shrub appearance on a quadrat is on the x-axis against the year that grass disappeared on a quadrat on the y-axis. And so each one of these points represents a quadrat. The error bars indicate uncertainty in the timing. Some of the quadrats had gaps in their sampling, so we're not always entirely sure when the vegetation changed. And this diagonal line is the 1-to-1 line. So quadrats that are on or close to that line had shrubs appear on them, and simultaneously the grass disappeared. Quadrats that lie below this line have shrubs show up after grass loss, meaning they experienced a period of bare ground, or bare ground maybe with some annual plants or forbs. So this point right here lost its grass in the 1950s, but shrubs didn't appear until the 2000s, about 50 years later. And notice there are also some points above the line. So these quadrats are ones where shrubs colonized the quadrat, but the grass population didn't go locally extinct for sometimes up to decades. So it's possible that we're looking at two separate but related processes, grass loss and shrub encroachment. Unfortunately, it isn't possible to draw much inference about the process of shrub encroachment since these quadrats are so small, but we are able to investigate factors related to the perennial grass declines. So I'm going to go on and talk in some more detail about the perennial grasses. The first perennial grass species I want to talk about is black grama, which looks like this. Up until now, I've been talking about total grass cover with all species combined, but now I'm going to talk about some of the key species of the Jornada separately, because the story is a little different for different species. So black grama is an important forage species, and we know it's susceptible to declines from drought and overgrazing, so it's often used in the Southwest as an indicator of grassland decline. So this is a plot showing the prevalence of black grama on the quadrats over time. The y-axis is showing the percent of the quadrats where black grama is present out of a subset of the quadrats that have favorable conditions. So this represents about 60 quadrats. And in the beginning, we have 100% presence. All 60 quadrats had some black grama on it. There's some slow decline until you get to the 1950s, where there's this sharp cliff where black grama disappeared from most of the quadrats. Notice I put in this gray box here, and that represents a drought. There was a severe drought in the early 1950s that was associated with grass declines across southern New Mexico. And you'll notice that after that, the grass never really recovered until the modern era. And notice I put in a second box here, which represents a more recent severe drought that occurred around 2011. However, there isn't a second decline in black grama presence here. And there could be a few reasons for that. So it could mean that the quadrats where it remained are locations where it was able to maintain through this 1950s drought. So it just might be that these locations are not susceptible to drought. And again, notice that this is basically a one-way transition. There were a couple instances in the 1960s where a few quadrats gained back black grama, but that is not common. Usually when a quadrat or a local area loses black grama, it doesn't recolonize. Diving a little deeper into this species, the second plot is showing the average cover of black grama per quadrat on the quadrats where it is present. So this, as cover goes to 0 on a quadrat, those quadrats were removed from this analysis. And again, what I want to show with this plot is that you can see this sharp decline during that 1950s drought. So not only did it disappear from many quadrats during the drought, but where it did remain, cover decreased. But following the drought, on the quadrats where it remained, cover recovered a little bit. Comparing that to the 2011 drought, cover actually increased slightly during this drought. But this could be a legacy from a few years before the drought where there was above average rainfall. And again, the last data point in 2016 is showing a decline, which is not immediately explainable based on rainfall. So let's compare the black grama story to a different perennial grass. This is Mesa dropseed. So when you look at the presence of Mesa dropseed over time, again, you see that drop during the 1950s where it went locally extinct on many quadrats. But it quickly recolonized and even colonized more quadrats after the drought than it was present on before the drought. When you look at the 2011 drought, there's also a drop in presence and some amount of recovery 5 years later in 2016. When you look at average cover per quadrat of dropseed, again, you see, just like with the black grama, there's a decrease in cover during the drought, recovery after the drought. But the two droughts are a bit different. So in recent years, of course, cover is more variable than it was. And again, we're only looking at 5-year intervals since 1995. But you can clearly see a large increase during the 2006 sampling, which is probably related to that increased rainfall that I mentioned before. And in 2011, during that drought, there's a reversal of that increase. The decline in cover continues to decrease in the last data point in 2016, just like we saw with black grama. And again, we don't immediately have an explanation based on rainfall or climate conditions for why that would be. So the next natural question is, can we generalize these results? Why are we seeing these declines across species, and what factors might be influencing where we see declines? So while drought is clearly an important factor, it's not the only answer. So we've seen that different species reacted differently to drought conditions. And even looking at the same species, droughts at different times had different results. So the 1950s drought versus 2011. We also know that soil properties are important. We're working on some models that are showing that higher clay content means that a quadrat is less likely to see a grass decrease during drought periods. So far I've talked about factors that can reduce loss of grasses, but are there factors that can encourage regrowth after the grasses are lost? And to answer that question, I have to admit that just by looking at the Quadrat data, it doesn't look promising. So looking at this trend since 1995, it looks like we may lose all of our grassy quadrats in not too many years. However, there are some currently other projects on the Jornada that are finding that it is possible to recover perennial grasses of some species, even in shrub-dominated areas. So some current research is looking at how to best facilitate that growth, especially during wet periods. And one promising tool is a connectivity modifier, or a conmod, which is this small structure, which is made of wire mesh. And when placed on the landscape, they effectively slow down erosion and catch seeds, leaf litter, and sediment to encourage grass growth. And for more information, there's a new paper on that project out this year. See Peters et al. 2020 in Ecology. So to conclude, the permanent Quadrat data set gives us a 100-year record of perennial grass populations on the Jornada. And we can use it to learn a lot about what factors likely contributed to all the declines that we've seen. But there is hope for the future, and current research is finding that it is possible to reestablish perennial grasses under the right conditions. And with that, thank you for listening.